Hi everyone, and welcome to my panel on clever writing, clever characters. I am Zephyr. I have been running the writing track here today. I thank you all for attending. We've been having a great time. A lot of you are really interested in writing, it appears, so that is awesome. Sorry for the quick cutoff on that last panel. I had to rush over to this one, and, you know, AV, we really should start putting gaps between these things, but we'll figure that out later. Anyway, thank you for coming. So this is going to be a talk about both how to make stuff feel clever when you write. And by clever, what I mean is smart characters. You know, usually you'll see like geniuses or Sherlock Holmes types or stuff like that. But also plots that feel clever. That is things where you're like, oh, wow, you know, when there's that reveal and you put the dots together. You know, a lot of times you see that in mystery stories, things like that. So we will start talking about that today. If you have questions, there is the writing stream audience panel. I throttled that back down a little bit. If you have questions, try and post them towards the end. I'll try and take a Q&A if I can. I won't be able to necessarily watch everything that comes through in the meantime, though. So let's see here. We've got clever writing, clever characters, or how to write like you're a mastermind when you're not one. So let's go over a couple of things that constitute clever stories. First of all, we've got mysteries. These are the sort of the more esoteric mysteries, but also the typical whodunit. There's a crime, we're going to solve it. The Sherlock Holmes stuff. We got heist and escape stories. Ocean's 11, Shawshank Redemption, etc. Heist and escapes are really just sort of the opposite of each other. Like one's breaking in and one's breaking out, right? Then a more generic category is problem-solving stories. A lot of times these end up being sci-fi stories. That's pretty common in that because there's a lot of science, and science is essentially a method of solving a problem or figuring out a mystery, really. Some good examples there on the slide. Contact, Swiss Family Robinson, I would say, is problem-solving. How to survive in a place where you don't have your normal tools. The Martian is a great sci-fi example of that, the recent movie, where you have to solve problems or you're going to run out of air and food. So another type of thing where we look at characters and we say they're clever is like tactics and strategy. Sometimes that's military. Sometimes that's stuff like business acumen or even crime bosses, people that plan and plot. Social plotting, too, where people set someone up for a fall, that sort of thing. And there's one that I think everyone likes to think of as clever, twists and surprise endings. I put a line through that because I don't think those are clever writing. I think they're just surprising, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not the same as what I'm really talking about when I say clever stories. So, let's see here. Mysteries. These are the most traditional use of what I would call clever stories. They usually feature a detective or an investigator, you know, the Sherlock Holmes or whatever detective's on the beat, right? The character is usually a very clever person in this as well. So it's not just that the story has a clever crime or mystery, but Sherlock Holmes himself is shown to be really smart and really clever. There's a basic outline they all seem to follow. There's a crime that we're shown, and it's typically a mystery. Clues are found, they're connected, and connecting those leads to the solution. That is, finding the criminal in most cases. The next category is heist and escapes. As I mentioned, they're sort of the inverse of each other. Heist is breaking in, escape is breaking out. One thing about this, they don't necessarily always have a single person, but usually they do, and it's usually like the mastermind that's planning the heist. The Daniel Ocean in Ocean's 11, right? There's a mastermind planning everything, but usually he's moving other people around too that have some more specializations. But a very similar pattern. The challenge is presented. That is, hey, they keep the money in the farthest safe down in the basement, or hey, the guards are, and there's like 6 miles of barbed wire in a minefield. We got to get out of here. But instead of looking for clues, what those clues are in this case are weaknesses. So they're looking for weaknesses in the defenses, either to get out or to get in. And they highlight those usually in a planning scene. And then they find a way to put those together into a scheme. And when they do that, and they do it successfully, they get to a successful exploit. They're either in or out like they're supposed to be. Well, when it goes their way. Storytelling can go other ways, but the general setup is that. In more generic things, problem solving. As I mentioned, this wide category. This covers a lot of stuff. usually you don't just get a single like lead detective or something in these. You end up with a lot of times teams. For the sci-fi stuff, you'll end up with scientists and engineers or someone with a particular set of skills. Like Jurassic Park, right? Like there's multiple scientists working down there in that lab. They're shown to be clever. We'll get to that in a minute. But even things like Contact, there's a team of experts working, all specialists in their field, to try and decipher the message they've received. Stuff like that. Arrival's another great example. But the outline, very similar to the previous ones. There's a problem or obstacle, a mystery. What is this alien writing? What is this message we got from deep space? What is wrong with the engines? What happened to these people on this now dead planet? Same process. They gather information, though, primarily. It's not necessarily clues, but you can think of it that way. They learn stuff. Maybe they go reference, we need to look up this ancient language or something like that. But because it's a group, they'll tend to brainstorm rather than just someone makes a plan. There's people talking and brainstorming for a while, but they find the solution and usually find the answer. The last major category to me, and it's even broader than the last one, is the tactics and strategy. These are things like military, sports, or business stuff. So usually there's one strong leader with usually a team. That can be like a coach or quarterback in sports movies. You've got a crime boss leading a syndicate when they're gonna, run their rivals out of town. In some rare cases, they're political things where there's a president or a political figure. And in military stuff, it's a general or a warlord or a war leader, a war chief. It's telling people how we're going to get around those overpowering defenses. But at the end of the day, that same outline works. The necessity for battle is given. The fact that we have to have a battle or we have to do this attack is sort of incidental to the cleverness of the story. It's just this is what needs to happen. But it's done with information gathering, a planning session, and usually in war movies, there's this thing where they're either, in playbooks and whiteboards, they scribble on ideas and plays. In war movies, like Game of Thrones or stuff like that, you'll see them sitting around that table, pushing the figurines around with a little like they're all playing Warhammer. The thing that usually happens is that they find some unorthodox tactic, because most stories are more interesting if you're looking at the underdogs. It's not interesting to say, we have 50 million more people than the enemy side, we're just going to attack. There's no need for cleverness there. So when cleverness is involved, usually they find some unorthodox tactic, something that wouldn't just be, the archers stay back while the footmen advance. But then they make a battle plan around this idea, and most cases it works because most movies like the people we're following to win. So I pointed out over and over again, the common elements though are that same kind of plot. What it comes down to is connecting the dots. So, in my opinion, and this is just opinion, all discussion on how to do art or writing is opinion really, but in my opinion, there's 4 requirements for a clever story. There's a lot of fine detail around them, but I think in my mind, these are the key things that make me think a story is clever versus where it fails at it. And I think if you can keep these in mind, and we'll highlight these again later, you can really get to thinking or feeling a story is clever or to writing one that is. So first of all, clues, that is the dots when you're connecting the dots, are shown before they're being used. The clues connect with each other in a believable way. I could say that, here's a banana, that must mean this person has a fruit allergy, but if I just say that in a story, that's not necessarily the first thing most people would leap to. It might be too far of a stretch. So they need to be a believable connection. Excuse me. The connection of clues has to lead logically to the solution. That is, it must follow to, most people that, hey, if this, and this happen, and all these line up, then this is the answer, the solution, the guilty party. In a crime thing, you have to convince the jury of this. So you lie all that stuff, and you have to logically convince the jury that means this person's guilty. In other stuff, if it's not logical, then there's no point in trying to pretend you're clever because the connection should just be whatever you say they are, because magic or something. And here's the last one that I almost didn't put on here, but I came back and realized this is actually kind of important. No other relevant solutions fit the clues. It's one thing to say that A leads to B and B leads to C, so therefore A leads to C. But if B could also lead 3 or 4 other places, the fact that one of those is C isn't enough to say that we found a reasonable solution. We're going to go over all these in detail here in a minute. So the question is, why does this 4-step process work? So, the secret sauce, the audience, you guys, the reader, me when I'm reading, me when I'm watching, you when you're reading, you when you're watching. What matters in a story is not that you wrote a genius, it's that your audience feels like that is a genius. That they feel like that was a clever twist or an interesting plot or a brilliant solution to something. So it's less about how smart your character is because, and that's why you can also write people smarter than you are. I can't write a fiction about Einstein if I had to be as smart as Einstein to make him look smart. So, yeah, the audience, to feel that your story is clever, the reader needs to feel clever themselves. We get a lot of stuff as humans from sympathetic processes. So you can tell me someone is smart, but if I don't get that, if I don't feel empathy with that, then it just starts to feel a little alien. So in order to make the audience themselves feel a bit clever, they need to understand the cleverness of what your character is doing, what your plot is doing. So because of that, that's why they need to see the dots and start connecting them along with your characters. That's why it's important to show beforehand, because your audience is trying to solve that mystery in their own head or connect those dots. And if you let them follow along, then they're right there with your characters and seeing the cleverness in action. In my opinion, the best stories, at least the best stories for demonstrating, making someone feel that you really wrote something clever, is where the reader or the viewer gets a smirk on their face right before the big reveal happens because they figured it out just in advance. That means you were giving them the clues at just the right speed and they solved it before you gave them the answer. That means that all your dots connected in the way that they should. That means all of it was timed right. And they get to feel like they solved it before they were handed it. So they get that euphoria of, figuring out the problem. So one of the keys for that is to know your audience. By that, I mean, who are you writing to? There's young adult novels. There's, high sci-fi, very brainy stuff. But at the end of the day, it's somewhere in the middle. Don't write a PhD thesis because even though that's what real geniuses do, it usually doesn't make for a good story and it probably won't be understood by your audience, even though your character is supposed to be able to understand it. At the same time, don't explain things like a 5-year-old level to your audience. You got to trust them. You got to trust that they can keep up with what you're writing. And that's one of the hardest things is figuring out exactly where to leave those dots out so that they can follow along. But usually the audience follows along better than you think. Usually when I see it go wrong, it's that people over-explained and handheld their audience. So where does it go wrong? These are the common pitfalls that I usually see when people try and do clever stuff, whether characters or stories. So the first one is a variation of the Deus Ex Machina. Deus Ex Machina, for those not familiar, means it's an old Greek term from the stage when something comes out of nowhere to solve things. It means God from the machine, and it used to be the way they'd wrap up a play if they didn't have a real answer. God would just descend in like this little pulley machine from the sky and just magic everything happy. In this case, what I mean by that is that at the end, when you've been connecting these dots, if the dots aren't shown until the very end, then the reader had no chance to keep up and feel clever because you just pulled whatever you wanted out of thin air at the end. My example here is, a detective that was in there or saying that they had solved the crime and you've seen them find 2 or 3 clues, but you still have no idea. And there's but you forget is that I speak Chinese. And if you've never known that he spoke Chinese, you're like, oh, okay, I guess that does change things while you're in that Chinese cafe. So I know exactly what he said this whole time. And then he explains the answer. That's just pulling it out of thin air. That's not satisfying. The reader has to connect things on their own. Another one I find is pretty common is the giant leap. That's going too far on one clue in this case. So this sort of plays into it has to be a believable connection between them. So my example here, he had peanut shells in his pocket, so he must have been to the circus recently. Wait. plenty of reasons people might have peanuts, especially if you've ever been to a country restaurant, besides going to the circus. So that leap doesn't necessarily follow from the evidence. So that's going too far, and that's violating rule number 2 there. Then there's the plot hammer. That's basically when your characters just abandon logic and everything just sort of is ignored for the mystery, usually because the author really wanted a certain thing to happen a certain way and wasn't sure how to get there with following the actual logic that would happen, and just said, nope, I just really, really, really want a scene with these characters doing this. And so, it becomes a form of the idiot ball, if you're familiar with that trope. Horrible example, the movie The Core. Oh no, the Earth's core stopped spinning. So the only way to fix it is to send a bunch of humans down in a magma submarine. Wait, what? How is that the easiest solution? I mean, there's got to be like a million things they didn't try before. Let's pack a bunch of toasty, warm water-based bipeds and send them through molten rock. That was the easiest solution? No. That's because they just thought it would be cool if we had a magma submarine and then tried to make a movie around it instead of the other way around. And then there is the final one, the twist. When it's done well, a twist, it can be a surprise, as I said earlier. This is not a diatribe against the concept of twist in general. It's just they're usually abused and misinterpreted. Surprise is not the same as cleverness. A twist that reveals logically can be really, really fun, but it's really hard to do right. What I'm talking about here is you thought this led to A, but it's really B. And the problem is, if the audience had all the logical reason to know that A was a valid option, if it's also valid that from all the clues and dots that have been connected, that option B is also viable, then you're violating rule 4. If it could lead to multiple things, then now you're just pulling it out of thin air. Why is it suddenly not A? You're just saying, aha, we left a red herring for you. It looked like A, but it's really B, and we didn't tell you why. And so it feels like a betrayal to the audience a lot of times. So, it's like, you thought you were clever, but we're cleverer than you. Or I, the author, am cleverer than you. And anytime an audience feels that, they are probably not going to enjoy your stuff as much. All right, let's see. So let's look at some good examples. I say good, decent. And I'm trying to stick to well-known pop culture. There's tons of books and my favorite stories and all sorts of stuff, but I'm hoping to stick to things here for examples that most people have a chance of having seen or read. So forgive me for being pop culture here. Game of Thrones, I know that the last season was not anybody's favorites, but early on in the show, they had the Battle of Blackwater. And in that, Tyrion is supposed to be a clever character. He's supposed to be the clever character in that show, more or less. Everyone else is scheming, but Tyrion's always just a little bit ahead of them, and he's snarky about it, so we love him. But the Battle of Blackwater is when they had the naval battle that was attacking the Red Keep, when Xanatos was attacking, I think, season 3 or 4 or something. Anyway, what they did was there's this chain... spoilers for Game of Thrones 5 and 6 years ago, sorry. But they basically lured the enemy fleet into the bay, and then they had this chain that had been hanging underwater that they brought up that blocked the ships from leaving, and then they basically nuked them with this stuff called wildfire, which is kind of a version of Greek fire. So the important thing is, though, they did this in the order of operations. We're seeing from the King's Landing side, the chain, the wildfire, we'd seen it used, we've seen how dangerous it is. We see Tyrion ordering the fleet to leave the bay, like their defensive fleet, because he's saying, well, they're definitely going to lose, so why have them sunk here when we can't win? They should just go out to sea so we can use them later. And everyone's debating that's not a good idea, but it's unorthodox. But it works because we're on Tyrion's side in this. We see it from his point of view, and we kind of like him because he's clever, and we're starting to root for him, and we're in on the plan. So we get to feel clever by knowing that a surprise is coming. That seems pretty clever from the way it was set up. The dots were laid out in advance, and we see them connect, and Tyrion connect them, and it looks great. But more importantly, we can sympathize because we get to be on the side that is with the clever guy, and it's fun to watch the bad guys or the enemy fall into those traps. So making a sympathetic character that's clever helps the audience tag along with that feeling. Another good one is one of my favorite shows, Stargate SG-1. I'm going to try and sum this up really fast, so I'm not going to go over all these details, but they've shown throughout the show that wormholes can't open in certain conditions if there's like a plate right in front of them. so they can be blocked, but only like at a super short range. But if it has more than an inch or two, then this big bubble comes out, goes whoosh, and it basically vaporizes anything in this big little like cavity where the wormhole forms. That old bubble effect you see in the show sometimes. But some enemy figures out they could send a particle accelerator through, and it starts melting their iris, and it becomes an issue for an episode. And all these things are like seasons apart and episodes apart. All this is assembled slowly as part of the show's canon about how the technical stuff works. Years later, a gate gets buried while a team's away, and they can't figure out how to get them back because they can't open the gate because it's now basically encased, buried in rock. But they use the particle accelerator effect that they basically have stolen the idea from their enemy. They use it, then they use the whoosh effect to make a bubble, and then they're actually able to toss some radios in, then they're able to send tunneling equipment, and then they're able to get their people off the planet. All of that was set up over seasons of building, here's the dots, here's the dots, here are the dots. And so as they come up with the plan, you're like, yes, that works. Everything I know about 5 years of watching this show, I see how they put all these dots together, and it feels brilliant. I mean, there's years later, they dial a gate and drop it into a star, and that's even more impressively like a connect the dots thing. But it took them years to leave all those clues, and they never cheated and changed them on us, which I think is a great example. Way better than the core. Some bad examples. Oh, The Village. This is that M. Night Shyamalan movie about this medieval village that has some mystery, like sacrificial, like creatures that move around in the darkness, and maybe they're sacrifices, maybe they're killing people. Same standard medieval mystery, like it looks like a horror movie or like Midsummer sort of does. So it sets it up that way, but it does the twist, and no one should see this movie, so I'm spoiling it. Oh no, it's actually the modern day, and these people were like scaring their children with these monsters to try and keep them from joining the modern world, like some sort of weird technophobic Amish secret society with doom and gloom. The problem is that that twist isn't really explained by anything that was happening. There were only one or two clues to it, and now nothing makes sense because how would you keep all the modern world out? Like no airplane contrails, no any of this. And they sort of throw a few ideas that explain that. Oh, well, we made this a no-fly zone for like, but thousands of miles in any direction, or you know, you can see a pretty wide swath of the sky for flying over airplanes, and airplanes fly everywhere in the U.S. these days. Anyway, lots of reasons why the explanation all of a sudden requires so many more dots to justify it than it had ever laid out, that the twist is just fun because it's a surprise if you like that, but it's not genuinely clever in my opinion. Interstellar, here's one that'll be controversial for a lot of people. A lot of people love this movie. I love the effects in it. I think it looks beautiful. But every time it gets the chance to really do some actual scientific method stuff, it drops it. Like this idea that we have to evacuate the Earth to some unknown planets because we can't grow corn. I mean, you're going to terraform another planet, but you can't terraform just the damaged one we're on. And it wasn't like there was some nuclear holocaust. This is just, oh, crops just got worse and worse as we polluted. Like, the other planet doesn't even have oxygen yet, maybe. Like, they skipped that. And then other ones about, well, love is better than science. And it can reach through multiple dimensions and pluck strings in a magic library. It tries to be clever, but it's really not. And I think that just because it used a lot of the dressings of cleverness, like scientific language, and they did some great stuff, like the model of their black hole was scientifically derived. So like some bits of it, they really went all out on. And I think because of that, it leads to this feeling that the rest of the movie is a very smart movie, even though some of the things the characters do are dumb as a brick, in my opinion. Other bad examples that are more common. Most supervillains, mostly because they get described as being super geniuses or masterminds, or, you know, they have these super volcano layers or whatever. And the problem with that is that they're not really ever shown. Well, sometimes they are in good comic books and good stuff, but the bad ones are just shown the trappings of intelligence. Again, it's just window dressing. They work in labs. They're surrounded by gadgets. They invent things, but we only ever see the eureka moment, the moment where they're like just putting the final bolt in their giant ray gun of doom, right? We never see how in the world they figured out how to make the giant ray gun of doom. We're just told, oh, they're just super smart, so it works. And so you're just supposed to believe they're super smart because we're told they're super smart. It's definitely a telling, not showing thing to me. Ocean's 11, another one. It's a heist movie, so they're trying for this giant clever thing, but it all relies on a giant EMP generator, which is scientifically impossible and might as well just, like, they have an alien super weapon, basically, and they're using it to rob casino instead of just selling it on the black market for $500 billion. The necessity that your heist involves impossible weaponry just violates all that believability stuff to me that makes things look clever. Like, if I had that, I could do anything I wanted to because I could hold the U.S. hostage. I could be Dr. Evil. $1 million. All right, and the best worst example of a clever thing in pop culture. Clue, the movie. I don't know how many of y'all have seen this, but it is based on the board game. It's a 1985 movie. It's got Tim Curry in it. It's a really weird one, but I would say it's worth watching, especially like if you're having a late night party with friends or something, or you're in the mood for something a little bit dumb. Clue is that board game where you're trying to find out who done it. Colonel Mustard in the kitchen with the candlestick, that sort of process, right? So it's absolutely a deductive mystery, clue-based game. So when this aired in theaters, the whole movie plays out like the board game, right? They have the characters, there's lots of murders and this whole convoluted series of crimes, and everyone's trying to figure it out and blame each other and stuff. And it's played for comedy usually, but in sort of a dark way. But in the end of the movie, they find the solution and they line up, this happened and then so-and-so killed so-and-so with this, and then this guy did this and this and this, and they line up all the dots, and the audience goes, yeah, that makes sense. That all connects. And you're like, of course, yeah. Well, here's the problem. When you go to talk to your friend about having seen that movie, they're like, no, that wasn't what happened at all. This, and this happened. Well, both of those were shown, and both of them were good answers. And it turns out they showed different endings to the movie in different theaters. And both of them were, quote unquote, valid. They explained the crime, basically. That's an obvious violation of Rule 4. That is, the solution to your clue should only lead to one answer, or one relevant answer. So if it leads to two, that's definitely a violation. But it was played for comedy, so a little forgiveness there. But there was actually a third ending that actually ties the other two together. So the other two endings aren't actually the full end of the movie. This third ending that weaves everything together in this crazy, frenetic, just insane bit by Tim Curry. It's that part's beautiful when it happens. Ties it all together. So in reality, it does a twist by saying, that's not the whole story. This is just one more step on the way to the whole story. So it sort of subverts Rule number 4. It makes you think, that's stupid. But the subversion with different endings in different theaters was just lovely. All right. So now that we've talked about good and bad examples and stuff, let's see, what can we learn to write cleverly ourselves? So again, the 4 rules that I came up with, I think, are the best guideline, at least think of them as like a minimum requirement, perhaps. I'll recap them one more time. The clues, the dots you're connecting, have to be shown before they're being used. You can't show them afterwards and say, that was there the whole time, because the audience feels cheated. So the audience and they need to be shown early enough before, not 1 second before, but a little bit ahead of time, so the audience gets to think on it a little bit and be there trying to solve it with you. You got to give them a fair chance to figure it out. The clues need to connect with each other in a believable way. So once removed from each other is a good rule. Not, if this leads to this, it leads to this, leads to this, then this clue must point to this. Well, no, those are multiple clues along the way. This, if there's elephant dung on a shoe, it says they were around elephants. It doesn't mean they were at the zoo versus the circus, though, right? It's just that they were near elephants. The connection of clues needs to lead logically to the solution. Again, dung means elephant. That's logical. Peanut in pocket doesn't mean circus. Likewise, if I say, that guy had a tan, so he must really like the beach. No, plenty of people get tans because they have to work because of a lot of other things. So it needs to be a logical exclusionary thing. And then no other relevant solution. So for the full thing, whatever reveal, if there's any other way someone could solve it or explain it, if your audience says, it should have been this or it should have been this, if they can give you 10 alternate endings that all also make sense, then you didn't really narrow it down enough to say that why yours was genuinely clever when it could have been anything. So yeah, if all the clues point us to a lone killer, but also he has a cat, I need to move my window there. But they must not point to innocent people, because otherwise your jury's just going to have to acquit. Sorry if my my ugly moving mug here was covering up some of the words on those previous slides. My apologies. So how do we write cleverly? So here's some main tips for me. First of all, don't constrain yourself to linear writing. That is, write sometimes the solution at the end of it first. Then go back and scatter any clues you need to match. I mean, this is your time-traveling superpower, right? The reason you can write stuff smarter than you actually are is that you don't have to do it on the fly, only knowing as much as a blind character would, without knowing the future. You can go figure out what future you want to end up in, and then solve the maze backwards. And you can build the maze backwards to whatever shape you want to get you there. It takes some time. It takes some work. You might need to write things down and actually outline instead of just sitting down to write. I usually have a bad habit of, I just start mashing keys and just go through it linearly. And then it's like, ooh, I need to go redo this if I want to make it seem clever. Similar to that, take your time. Your characters have to think very quickly to seem smart. If Tyrion had to spend 5 minutes thinking of his witty comebacks, we wouldn't think he was that witty. But as a writer, you can spend 20 minutes thinking of the best joke about, Celestia's, Cersei's mother. Confusing my female monarch starting with C. But yeah, you can go back. The other thing is, do your research. You have all the time. Go make sure you got those scientific facts right. Go make sure you got that name right. Oh, you might learn something new. If you're looking up like something about the god of thunder and you find Thor, it might lead you to some more interesting little details about some of that Viking mythology that you can pepper in there. And having correct and obscure facts in your story can make things seem clever, especially if people go Google it afterwards and then find, oh, you got all this correct. This is actually a very interesting path to go down. I learned things from fiction. I learned stuff from Star Trek. I learned stuff from other sci-fi because it was, even though they were flying around in spaceships with phasers and warp drives, when they talked about a classification of a star, that's the same stuff I had in science class. So getting your facts right is really worth it. Another key is to let the audience in on the plan. I mentioned this earlier with Tyrion and Blackwater Bay. This applies when it's not the whole story, mind you. If the entire plot is a Sherlock Holmes novel, and once you reveal who the murderer is, story's over, don't do this. But if there's bits in your story, segments where you're trying to show especially that character is clever, like that Blackwater Bay thing, show the plan that your character is doing so the audience sees it before it happens, and they can watch the bad guys stumble into it. It doesn't always have to be bad guys in a trap, but you can see the process. If I work alongside, if I'm watching over the shoulder of a scientist as they, come up with their warp drive, then I think they're smarter than if they just come out of the back closet and say, I invented the warp drive, yay! So, let us into the character, and especially if it's a sympathetic character, we're much more likely to feel that we're clever by association, and therefore more likely to accredit the characters in the plot with cleverness. Let's see here. So, trust your audience to keep up. I mentioned earlier, trust your audience. Trust them to be smart, but trust them to see the clues as well. I mean, it's not a game. You're not an evil dungeon master trying to trick your players into not getting, or to falling into the trap. But, don't handhold them. Try and balance that. That's the hardest one to teach because it's just a matter of practice, and every story is going to be different on exactly how to do that. Importantly, don't try to be too clever. If you try and rub it in people's noses that this is the smartest story ever, I feel like that's how we end up with things like Interstellar or some of these movies that I think are a little full of themselves because they're trying to be, later M. Night Shyamalan stuff too, it's trying to be too clever, maybe. Keep the complexity to a reasonable level. No heistatrons. For those of us seen the Rick and Morty episode where he goes to HeistCon and he builds a robot to basically make heist movie plans because he says it's the dumbest thing in the world. And the plans just keep exponentially growing until there's 4,783 steps to this plan. And then it just doubles back and has a switcheroo and all these common elements. That episode's great at really tearing apart an overly complex, pretend clever plot. Don't do that. No heistatrons. If the reader needs to do that crazy conspiracy theory thing with yarn note cards and push pins all over their wall just to follow with your plot, most readers don't want to work that hard to keep up with it in order to understand it and feel clever. Same vein, keep your characters relatable. If you tell me that you've got someone so smart that they're smarter than a supercomputer and they can do stuff, you end up with the Mentats in Dune or stuff like that. Most of the time, those feel alien, not clever, right? like they don't feel like relatable characters. That, you know, it's not, oh, that's a really smart person. It's a, oh, that person just has a magic thing in their brain that makes them do stuff that I could never do. So it feels different. Some ways to make characters feel relatable is show them having minor failures. Like if you have a clever character, show them trying schemes early on and failing at them, or show them, you know, doing things a little bit wrong or making mistakes, because that humanizes them, but it also sets the difficulty level. Maybe it shows that they're competing in a very difficult profession, or that, you know, what their job or whatever their quest is really hard. So when they finally succeed at the big one later, when it really matters, we've understood this is a challenge, not just, oh, the hero always wins. Sometimes have the characters be genre savvy. And by that, genre savvy means they're aware of fiction. Like, you ever notice in sci-fi stories that no one's ever read science fiction? Like, try and avoid that if you can. Not always. It's not always appropriate in anything, but if you can, we like to latch on. We don't like to see a horror movie nowadays where they walk down, they say, what was that noise down in the basement? And someone says, oh, it was just the cat. And they go, oh, okay, well, I'm going to go check by myself here with the lights off. And anyone who's ever seen a horror movie knows that we've seen that too much to do it again. So it feels cliche. They need to be aware that it's never just the cat, or you don't split up in the dark forest, right? Like, we all know these things. So genre savvy can make your characters feel at least as smart as the reader is. They're not holding the idiot ball. So that helps. Lastly, their omissions can be great and yet subtle clues. So things you don't say can be almost as important as things you do. So I ragged on M. Night Shyamalan for The Village, but I will say The Sixth Sense is something a lot of people really like, and I think it's not always a 100% clever movie, but one of the clever things was some of the big clues is that he never talks to anyone else, and that's obvious usually only in hindsight. So the omission of something is sometimes the biggest clue in the whole thing. And that's a really good one. There's another one, a book I just read recently. I love John Scalzi. So John Scalzi's Fuzzy Nation. There's a bit in it where the dog keeps doing things without obvious prompting. I'm not going to say more because I really think everyone should read that book, and it's only a few years old, and Scalzi's great. But there's a way to omit stuff or show action with missing pieces, and especially if you're omitting stuff that, you know, the audience is going to expect there, then that can, especially if it repeats a few times, that lack of something can become a clue that's even a little bit more subtle. All right, let's see. What do we got here? Oh, you know what? Works better if I actually click on the slideshow instead of my presentation of the slideshow. So a couple of suggestions for things that I think are good examples of both clever stories and plots. So suggested read and watch. And after this, I'll be opening up Q&A in just a few minutes here. Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality. This is actually the story that by weird circuitous route got me into Pony, because the author of this started recommending some PonyFics way back in the day. For those that don't know, this is a fanfic that's longer than the actual Harry Potter novels. But it's, what if Harry was raised by loving parents? If Harry's aunt married a professor from Oxford instead of Vernon Dursley, and Harry had a loving home where he read sci-fi, and then he's like, oh, wow. So he's read Ender's Game, and he's the ultimate logician in that he's just way too smart for his age, but takes everything to a logical extreme. And when you have magic to play with, and yet you've watched Ocean's 11, or you've seen Ender's Game, or you know these smart characters, you start to do some really clever things, and I think it's a great one. Fuzzy Nation by John Scalzi, which I just mentioned, I would sell it as kind of it's To Kill a Mockingbird in space. So a lot of the cleverness in this involves court cases, but it's still a really fun one. It's not a John Grisham novel. There's still a lot of sci-fi action and interest in fun planets and new characters, but the core of the thing where the main character is really clever is around some court cases, and it's brilliant and heartwarming at the same time. The Thrawn trilogy by Timothy Zahn. It's the old school Star Wars extended universe. Thrawn is basically space Rommel. Rommel being the German general that Patton famously said, "Rommel, you magnificent." Well, I read your book, because he was like the cleverest general that he'd ever had to face. Zahn is that for the Empire. It's good. The Magicians, the TV show, is the one I've watched. I've heard the books are very good too. There's an episode where they speak in pop culture code because they realize they're being spied on. And so they just start talking completely in references to Battlestar Galactica, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Harry Potter, etc. So not only is it genre savvy, but because these fairies on this, magical world that they're in have no idea what in the world Battlestar Galactica is, who Grace Park is, or anything. And so they can develop the secret code that even though the ears and eyes of the fairies are everywhere, they can't decipher because it's not just a translation problem. It's a pop culture reference. And it's just nerd overload. They do a double thing that's even funnier where they put subtitles on it explaining like the literal meaning. Like, oh, yeah, well, what would Harry Potter do? And subtitles, no. I mean, you know, our Harry Potter, Quentin, because they have a character that is sort of relatable to Harry Potter. Sherlock, any version, he's the original mastermind detective. I mean, Sherlock Holmes is Sherlock Holmes, right? I love the BBC one. House MD has good and bad examples. House is pretty clever. They don't always line up the clues, but over the course of the series, they've done it enough times that you generally feel House is clever, but also jackass. But there's bad examples in that show, too, of House being clever, and he had no right to be because they didn't explain it. House just Deus Ex Machina says, oh, it's not this, it's this. They tried to avoid that on that show, though, so I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. Knives Out, murder mystery, great to done it. I think best picture of last year. Well, maybe tied with Jojo Rabbit. Very, very good murder mystery with a twist and everything, but done in ways that all the dots are there, in my opinion. And it's got great acting and characters and story. Watchmen, Ozymandias, super genius, the smartest man on earth, literally defined that way. So great examples of doing a character that's supposed to be smarter than literally every human ever. And then Cabin in the Woods, which is a genre-savvy one about that standard Cabin in the Woods trope. It takes all those tropes, turns them on their heads, has characters like the stoner guy that knows what's going, or like suspects. He's always so paranoid, he suspects. And so he acts totally logically because I'm not going to the basement by myself. I'm not doing that. He does all the smart things and gets other people to start behaving smartly. So they all try and logic their way out of it. The overall plot is actually a really interesting twist, too, of why people would be that dumb. There's maybe a logical reason for it. Let's see here. I think that is my final slide. Yeah, it is. So, let's see here. Got, about 10 minutes or so for Q&A. So I'm looking over the channel here. Let's see. That's rate limited to about 30 seconds. So, you know, it's a little slow, but, you know, if you can phrase your stuff in one message, that would help me. Let's see if we got any in there so far. Thank you guys for the comments. Pinkie Pie. Yeah. Game Watch. Clue, yeah, lots of people apparently like that. Yeah, you'll find it in video stores or online or something. All the modern versions have all three endings. Let's see, Bubblebeam mentions Walking Dead starts episodes with the most random out-of-context clips. They always look worse than they end up being, and then their insignificance later are wildly out of context. Yeah, that's called the... In media res, they sort of start with a thing that shows characters like in the middle of danger, and then all of a sudden they're just sort of out of it, or they go back a little bit. It's a cheap hook. I don't think it makes it necessarily clever. Let's see. Yeah, House is a bad person. Oh, yeah, yes, this is a stream for somebody that didn't realize this. Yeah, assuming I'm still on the stream. Yeah, I am, so... Tulip asked, I'm curious to what degree, if at all, your presentation here was influenced by the Abridged Guide to Intelligent Characters, a series of writing essays by the same person who wrote HPMOR. No, actually. I would say, I mean, it's influenced by my love of HPMOR. It probably made me think more specifically about why characters get clever. I think maybe I saw one or two of those blog posts he did once in a while, but I never realized that it was titled that or that he'd done a whole series of them. I think I just maybe, if he had linked one at the end of a chapter or something, when I was reading that chapter live, I might have seen it. So I can't claim no influence, but was not specifically thinking of that or having that in mind. Forgot it wasn't YouTube. Yeah, okay. So you were seeing the stream at least. Okay. I was worried people were just looking at the chat and thinking this was a boring room. All right. Well, I'll sit here for another minute or so and stuff, see if anyone else has any questions. Thank you guys for attending. I do appreciate it. Hope you guys enjoyed the content. Yeah, hopefully no questions means that maybe I made sense. That's the thing I like to hope for. Yeah, if there's any other like clever stories, there's so many of them that I had to narrow down to put as examples. I thought I better go with pop culture stuff. Just books are full of them. I would love to have found some more, especially I would have loved to have found some more good examples of female characters that are supposed to be the really clever one that weren't evil. All the female characters I could find that were supposed to be clever tend to be evil, like Azula in Avatar: The Last Airbender. There's a lot of them that are shown that way, but they're always not the good guys. Let's see. Bubble also asks, what is an example you can think of a very subtle, clever character? Subtle, clever characters. I think there's a lot of low-key stuff in Discworld. I think, like, Havelock Vetinari, like, whether you define, like, his actions as subtle, because he controls the whole city like a chessboard, and runs like one of the largest, the capital of the entire planet, more or less. And he does it without anyone knowing he's doing it because he just subtly manipulates things behind the scenes. So he's subtle in that sense. But the way the story is told, it's very clear to the reader. It's not subtle to the reader that he's a mastermind, chess master type. CIR, yes, I have read the Mars books. I do love those books. I read them years and years ago. So, it's been a while, and that's probably why none of those examples from that might have popped into my head. There's so much great sci-fi. The Expanse would be a good one. There's always clever characters in them, but the book isn't based around a clever plot, so it wasn't one of my examples probably. Granny Weatherwax from Discworld. Thank you, TD. Yes, yeah, definitely. She's one of my favorites all time. Had some of the most great life lessons while also being funny, a little bit bitter, like just everything a witch should be. So, yeah, thank you for the good example of a very clever, very awesome, very cool female character. Susan Stohill, yeah, she got brought in the later Discworld ones. Let's see. All the methods, so I think they're all the same. Game Watch asks, out of all the methods for clever writing that you've shown, what is your favorite? I think the point I was trying to make is that they're all sort of the same method. It's lining up the dots before you have to connect them. As far as like tips go, I think my main one is not doing linear because I have such a bad habit of always doing linear writing. I love to just freeform a story. I got a vague idea in my head and I just start typing till I get there. Making myself go non-linear is hard for me, so it's the biggest tip for me, and I think that's why I put it first. Taking your time. I'm a Wikipedia. I'll dive down Wikipedia holes for true facts all day long, so I usually don't have a problem with that. Let's see. Cumberbatch's Sherlock. Yeah, no, I'll agree. The BBC Sherlock, he tends to overreach, and I think the show does that for dramatic effect. It's definitely like examples of how they're making him look clever. Like some of the episodes do way better at showing the full process than others, and other ones they just sort of circumvent it because you already know he's smart. Let's just get on with something more dramatic in the love interest or some comedy bits because they're telling more than just a clever story. Death is an excellent character. I don't know that he would necessarily be, I wouldn't call him clever. I think he's more of a force of nature that likes cats and is fair. He's the ultimate version of justice in some ways. So, not particularly clever, although some of his quips are very witty at the time because he's seen it all and done it all. So, nothing gets past him, I think. Oh, I can't believe I've been talking for almost an hour here. It goes by fast. All right, I see a couple people typing there. Yeah, thank you guys for hanging out afterwards for the Q&A too. Appreciate it. Yeah, it does fly when I'm having fun, yeah. All right. Well, I think it's about time that I wrap this up and sign off. Let them actually have their gap for the thing. I will be around in the chat channels through the rest of the evening and stuff. One thing I want to remind everyone of that is watching the stream especially, we're going to be doing another open read and critique session later tonight, midnight, I believe, Eastern, 9 p.m. Pacific. Definitely look at the schedule, though. Don't take my word for it. Time zones are not my forte. And that's where you can bring your own fic and read the first 5 minutes of it in some small groups, and you'll get critique from the other readers, and you'll take turns reading and critiquing each other along with some of our staff there, including myself, that'll be giving some feedback on some things. So if you have some stories you want to shop, that's a great workshop and a way to meet some other writers and maybe find some other tips. So hope to see you all in the next panels. I don't know what's coming up here next. I can't remember offhand on the schedule, but we got a few more writing panels and then that final orc in a few hours. So thank you all again and have a good one. Well, all right. One more question. Do you like characters that are smart but don't show it off to other characters but only to the reader? Yeah. If it tells a good story, I don't have to have smart characters in my story. So to me, does that serve the purpose of the story? Does it make the story enjoyable that they keep it hidden? Because they do. They're sort of that secret superpower. You know this character's smart and they know they're smart, and it's secret. It's like Superman when he's Clark Kent. You don't have to show everyone how smart you are. You can keep that up your sleeve, and then you've got a minor superpower. Yeah, if you had some examples of that, Melody, that would be good. There was one I knew years ago. I used to have an example for that. I can't remember. I will try and think of it. If it pops up, I'll shout it out later in the channel in text. All right. Have a good one, guys. Thanks.